Welcome as everyone is joining into this webinar. Welcome again to the next in the series with the American Botanical Council and the Sustainable Herbs Program series on ethnobotany. And as we're waiting for people to enter, if you can take a moment and just introduce yourself in the chat, say who you are and where you're from, just so we have a sense of who we're speaking with. And at the end of the hour, in the last 10 minutes or so, we'll open for questions. And if you do have a question, please make sure to enter it in the Q&A and not the chat. And make sure that you include all attendees, not just the panelists, so everybody can see. And that's also in the chat. When you introduce yourself, make sure it's to all participants. So again, welcome to I think the fourth or fifth in the series, the Ethnobotany series, co-hosted by the Sustainable Herbs Program and the American Botanical Council. It's my real tremendous honor today to welcome Dr. Wade Davis, and I'll say a few words about Dr. Wade Davis first in a moment. First, I want to share my screen. So as I mentioned, this is in a series of focuses on plants and people, sort of more broadly than ethnobotany, really the cultural framework in which plants are used around the world. And on February 4th, I'll be speaking with Stephen King about his work developing a botanical drug that was approved by the FDA. And that conversation is going to be less really focused on the mechanics of the drug, but really what it takes to work with communities around the world, different cultures who have different practices in using plants as medicine, and what happens when you take that knowledge and medicine and produce medicines in a different cultural context. He'll talk about the politics and economics of that. So registration is open for that on the Sustainable Herbs Program and ABC website. And the other series that we're having of webinars is focused on this toolkit of best practices for the botanical industry, sort of built around sustainability and regenerative practices. And on January 21st, I'll be speaking with 3 producer groups from around the world. And our goal in these webinars is really to bring in different voices, not just those from the Western, Europe and regenerative practices. Am I back in the? Hello?
Yes, Anne, I think you're back.
Okay, so sorry about that. As I was saying, this is made possible through the generous support of our underwriters. And now I will go to introduce Wade. Sorry for that interruption. So Wade Davis probably needs no introduction from me, but he's the explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, or he was from 2000 to 2013. He's currently professor of anthropology and leadership chair in cultures and ecosystems at risk at the University of British Columbia. He holds degrees in anthropology and biology and received his PhD in ethnobotany. And he's also the author of 23 books. And I want to pause on that. 23 books. And they're 23 good books. They're rich in detail and stories and characters that really come alive. I've written 3 books, and each one takes me about 10 years. And so of all Wade's accomplishments, I think I'm most in awe of that. His latest book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, was published by Knopf in September, this past September, and it's been described as a love story, a love letter to Colombia. So with that introduction, there's so many different angles we could take this conversation. And for example, I'd love to know how you organize your notes, but we won't do that. I really want to really hear about your experiences from, I don't know how many years of really working with ethnobotany and culture and the insights you have for the current crisis of cultural and biological diversity loss. And I wondered maybe to start, if there was some moment from your childhood that kind of awoke you to culture and differences in culture or plants or something that brought it alive.
That's a wonderful, it's a wonderful question, and it's great to be with you. And I admire anyone who can write a book. So 3 books is a heck of a great output, in my opinion, and God bless you for it. Hemingway said that anyone who says that writing is easy is either a liar or a shitty writer. And we all know how hard books are to write, and congratulations on what you've done. I think that we have this idea that life is linear, that, we go somehow from A to B to C, and if we skip D and E, we don't get to the rest of the alphabet. But all of us who get to a certain age look back and realize that life is actually made up of these sort of serendipitous moments, what Joseph Campbell spoke about, the proverbial crossroads, where you had to sort of look to your inner compass, stay true to yourself, and find your way forward. And these moments happen in such a miraculous way. And I never thought of how I was drawn to culture until a journalist asked me some years ago in Canada. And I remembered and I realized that I'd actually grown up in the province of Quebec at a time when the French and English were famously the 2 solitudes. And literally there was sort of war in the streets. We had martial law, we had tanks in the streets of Montreal, bombings, kidnappings, and so on. It was a very tense moment in Canadian history. And I happened to grow up in an Anglophone community that was kind of a commuter community that was plunked like a carbuncle onto the back of a very old Francophone village that went back to the 17th century. And there was literally a boulevard, a road that separated the English community from the French community. And there was a little corner store there run and owned by a wonderful old Francophone couple. And my mom would send me down to that store on foot when I was 4 and 5 and 6 to get her cigarettes or milk or whatever the house needed. And I was invariably treated with great kindness. And there was a little bench outside the store. And as a boy of 6, I would sit on that bench and I'd look at that road. It was called Cartier Boulevard. And I knew that across that road was another language, another religion, another way of life. And that fascinated me. And I was equally kind of fascinated by the prohibition, not from my own family, but from the society in general. I wasn't allowed to cross that road, and that made me interested. And fortunately, I had an older sister who was a bit of a kind of James Dean wild thing, and she shattered that boulevard by falling in love with a Francophone boy who became a Mountie, a Royal Canadian Mounted Policeman. And if you know anything about Canada, young boys grow up to revere Mounties. And as a little boy of 7, once I burst through that barrier, I would actually do my exercises by doing pull-ups on Pierre's biceps. He'd hold his biceps like this, like Rocky. And as a little boy, I would pull myself up. And so I burst through that barrier and found myself in a world of wonder. And I think in a way, I've been crossing that street ever since. I was very fortunate as well, and that my mother, who was a modest and a humble, but a determined Canadian woman, told me in the summer of 1968, well, actually 67, when I was 13, that Spanish was a language of the future. And we weren't a wealthy family, but she worked all year very hard as a secretary in a public school to raise enough money for me to join a group of schoolboys that in 1968, in that summer, a schoolmaster was taking to Cali, Colombia, Colombia's third largest city. And remember that at a time when most Canadians and Americans had never been in a commercial plane, the South American destination was terribly exotic. And I was very fortunate because though I was the youngest of the lads by a couple of years, they were all billeted out with very affluent families and spent a kind of sweltering season in the streets of Cali. I, by contrast, was by chance billeted out with a much more modest family that lived up in the mountains at the edge of trails that reached west to the Pacific. And it was a kind of a classic Colombian scene, you know, children too many to keep track of, an indulgent father, a grandmother who sat on the porch and muttered to herself, overlooking fields of fruit trees and flower beds, and an angelic sister who more than once carried her brother and me home half drunk to a mother kind beyond words who feigned anger at the garden gate as she tapped her foot on the stone steps. And for 8 weeks, which is a long time in a young person's life, I became enchanted in this culture of some sort of strange intensity, an affection for good living, but also a quiet acceptance of the fragility of the human spirit. And many of the other Canadian lads in that distant summer succumbed to what the Colombians call mamitis, or homesickness. But I can honestly say that I felt quite to the contrary. I felt like I had finally found home.
Wonderful stories. I especially love the French Boulevard. Yeah. I want to stay kind of on this biographical track for a second. And so you went to Harvard and studied, you know, were sent to the Amazon under
Well,
Schultes.
no, it's better than that, Anne. I mean, how crazy a thing. And I think this is a good thing for, you know, sometimes young people, and I certainly as a professor get a lot of this, you know, they look up at someone like myself, and I'm now 67, for God's sake. And they say, you know, oh, he's been at the National Geographic, he wrote all these books, and it can almost be intimidating to a young person. How can I possibly do that? And my answer to all these young people, including my own daughters, is I'm 67. You're 28. Of course you haven't done all this yet. Just give yourself a chance. And that's the way life is. You won't believe this, but this is a true story. I went to Harvard because at 15, I used to fight forest fires, and our camps were overrun with draft dodgers from the Vietnam War. And we were these young, obedient and obsequious Canadian lads. And these draft dodgers would tell our foreman to piss off. And it was irresistibly charismatic. And I'd never met an American before. And one of them had the Life magazine in his backpack with the Harvard student strike of 1969 on the cover. And in a kind of atavistic way, I thought, wow, that must be the college you go to become cool like these guys. So I applied to Harvard, not even knowing where it was really. And I got in and I went and I got to Logan Airport. My parents didn't have the money to accompany me back to the East Coast from British Columbia. And I got there and I realized I didn't really know where Harvard was. So I saw this African-American guy with a Harvard t-shirt on in Logan Airport. He didn't know where it was either. And so I dragged my trunk through the subway system because my family didn't take taxis. And then I realized my mom had made a mistake and the dorms weren't open for another week. And I had nowhere to go and not a penny in my pocket. And I dragged my trunk through the streets of Cambridge until I found a church. And I knocked on the door, and this wonderful pastor took me in, and he became a great mentor and friend. But in that moment, I fell in love with the United States for obvious reasons. That such kindness, you know, such openness, and he was also by chance a war resistor, and so I became kind of radicalized and spent most of my first year making trouble, frankly. And when the time came around to select a major, I hadn't really given it much thought, and the deadline was the next day. And only by chance, I had been walking through the Peabody Museum of Ethnology that afternoon, and with my mind still swirling with these images of shaman in all the colors of the rainbow, I ran into a friend in the street and I said, Stuart, what are you going to major in tomorrow? And he said, anthropology. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, you read about Indians. And like Forrest Gump, I said, that'll do. And I signed on as a steward of anthropology. And And I fell into the orbit of David Maybury Lewis, one of the great Americanists, one of the great humanists, one of the great activists who founded cultural survival. But I also, after a couple of years of just reading about Indigenous people in books, I wanted something more visceral, something more authentic. And I was literally in a cafe in Harvard Square with my roommate, who was also a student of anthropology. And by complete chance, again, there was a map of the world, a National Geographic map of the world right beside us. And David looked at me and he looked at the map. He looked at me and he raised his arm and he pointed to the high Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere, and I watched my left arm go up and hit the Northwest Amazon in Colombia. And within a week, David was gone and never came back from the Arctic. And within 2 weeks, I would be in Colombia. But before going, I stopped by the office of course, the legendary ethnobotanist, Richard Evans Schultes, whose course I had taken that fall. And I just announced to him, I saved up money in a logging camp. I'm from British Columbia. That was key because he was such an Anglophile. One of his colleagues, Weston Labar, who did the peyote work with him, famously quipped that the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London. So I said, I'm from British Columbia. And of course, he thought Columbia was his beloved Colombia. And I want to go to South America and collect plants like you did. And aside from his introductory course, Plants and Human Affairs, I had never studied botany in my life. I hadn't taken a biology course in my life. I grew up in the forest. I was a park ranger. I was a logger. I grew up as a lover of the wild in British Columbia, but I had no formal training whatsoever in biology. And this man, who many of your guests on this seminar will know, was the father of modern ethnobotany. He was a man for whom mountains would be named in protected areas in South America in time. He was the man who had sparked the psychedelic era, in a sense, with his discovery of the so-called magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. He would then, in 1941, take a semester's leave of absence from Harvard and disappear in the Northwest Amazon, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, making 30,000 botanical collections, and documenting for the first time for science the use of over 2,000 medicinal plants. And he was a legend, but I didn't really even know it at the time. And he, as I walked into that office, and he was in his white lab coat, his proverbial Harvard tie around his neck, his antiquated bifocals with a mound of plant specimens. And it was extraordinary. Rather than asking me for my credentials or what courses I had taken or what my plans were, because I had none, he simply asked me, when I said, I want to go to South America, as you didn't collect plants, he just said, well, son, when do you want to go? And that was it. 2 weeks later, and then, in order to placate my little mother back in Victoria, British Columbia, who kept saying, are you sure Professor Schulte says this is a good idea? She just go and see him one more time. So I went to see him one more time, and he had 3 pieces of advice. He said, don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck. And then he said, don't forget to wear a pith helmet, because in 12 years, he had never lost his bifocals. And his 3rd piece of advice was certainly not going to placate the concerns of my mother. He said, don't come back from the Amazon without trying yahe, ayahuasca, the most powerful of these shamanic preparations. And so that's how it all began. And it was, I remember, and this is again a message for young people, I could distinctly remember the trepidation with which I departed for South America with no plans. I can even remember my foot touching the tarmac at El Dorado Airport when I landed, and I froze for an instant. I was 20 years old. I had no plans, nowhere even to go that night. And I watched my right foot sort of freeze, but then I just watched my left foot move forward. And guess what happened next? My right foot moved, and then my left foot moved. And they were the first paces on a journey that would last 15 months and take me to every corner of South America. But every journey of a lifetime begins with one step.
That's wonderful. There's so much I could ask about that, but I want to go to your trip to Haiti, because in talking with you before, it seemed like that's really where your ideas around culture began to
Well, yeah,
change.
I think it's where it's very, in terms of transparency. I mean, there's an element. I mean, I love the work that you do, Anne, and I love the Botanical Council. Mark's an old friend of mine, but in the kind of in the service of transparency, I think it is worth, you know, what happened. I was always someone interested in culture from the very beginning. And yet I found myself too young to understand the nuances of ethnology. No one was teaching why anthropology matters, right? And it was very frustrating to me. And one of the things that happened when I went to South America with a botanical lens is suddenly I had something I could touch. It was tactile. I could collect plants. I could study botany. It was an absolute revelation to me, until I discovered the world of botany, which I did at a very late age. A forest was just a sort of a beautiful collection of various hues of green, right? And the minute I understood taxonomy, all of those life forms had relatives. All of those life forms had a lineage. I found phylogeny to be absolutely fascinating. It was as if the entire history of the world was before you every time you entered a forest. And so in that sense, I became enchanted with botany. And for about 6 years, from 74 to 82, all I thought about was plants. And I was a very precocious botanical explorer. I was very lucky to be mentored, not as much by Schultes, who at that point was too old to go to the field, but by Tim Plowman, his great protege. And Tim and I, studying coca, traveled together for well over a year. And I could not have had a better mentor, because Tim was the ultimate botanist, but he also was a poet. He also had a great sense of people. He taught me everything from yoga to Spanish to Latin binomials to how you deal with indigenous people. He was a man of stunning grace and accomplishment. And he also taught me to collect plants. I didn't realize at the time that he was kind of the Michelangelo, or better said, the Rembrandt of plant collecting. His specimens were so stunningly beautiful. And I thought that was just the way you made a specimen, but I didn't realize it was Tim. And he also had a very democratic sense of botany. He would never go to an area and just collect the plants that he was interested in for his own scientific project. He felt that those of us lucky enough to be in the field had an obligation to collect everything. And so we spent on that expedition, even though it was focused on the ethnobotany and the taxonomy and the origins of erythroxylon, and particularly the two cultivars, Novagranatense and coca, the divine leaves of immortality, if you will, and the botanical sources of cocaine. We collected everything. So it was a fantastic opportunity for me to learn fundamental plant taxonomy in the field with a master. And so one thing I learned to do is to go places where no botanist had ever been. And because of that, my specimens were often quite unusual. And that allowed me to jump to the front of the queue when it came to having them identified by authorities around the world. And in fact, my very first plant collection with my only first number was a new species of coca, and and so this was enchanting to me. But to be honest, after a while, after 6 years of that, and I would collect over 6,000 numbers myself, which was quite a high tally for a young botanist who hadn't even entered graduate school yet, but after a while, it began a little bit to feel like collecting hay to me. I mean, I went to so many places and sort of did the ethnobotany. I mean, in a way, before I got to graduate student, I had done PhD level investigations, the ethnobotany of the Guarani, investigations in the use of various psychoactive plants, particularly San Pedro in Huancabamba. I had hunted down strange admixtures like chamairo, the admixture to coca used by the Machigenga and Shimane in the forest of eastern Bolivia. I had lived amongst, a dozen or more indigenous people and surveyed their ethnobotany. But at the end of the day, I didn't know what I could do with that data. And it struck me that ethnobotany, in a sense, was more a description of an activity and a point of view than a science. And it hadn't really developed its own paradigm. What were we really trying to do? It was kind of a hodgepodge of, where people would come, for example, typically to study with Professor Schultes, and come to study ethnobotany specifically, as indeed Tim did, as Mickey Balick did, as Bob By did. And they would get there and realize that when you got to the core of ethnobotany, it was hard to find that they're there. What was ethnobotany? And so a couple of his students, like Homer Pinkley and Bob By particularly, were able to take ethnobotany into really interesting places, and scholarly, a very wonderful academic way. But many of Schultes' students, like Mike Balick or Tim, ended up doing taxonomic revisions of economically interesting plants. In the case of Mickey Balick, the Jacinia enocarpus complex of palms in the Amazon. In the case of Tim, this curious medicinal plant Schiricaspi or Brunfelsia in the Solanaceae family, that was used as a fever bush throughout and as a hallucinogen throughout the Northwest Amazon and along the Andes. And so as I struggled when I went back to study ethnobotany with Professor Schultes for my PhD, I struggled to find a PhD subject that I felt I could get I wanted something I could get a kind of an intellectual handle on, right? And I wasn't really by nature a taxonomist. I didn't want to simply describe the use of plants by a people. I had done so much of that. And I really wasn't into the kind of work that the brilliant ethnobotanist Timothy Johns did on the origins of cultivated tubers in the Andes. He was really a phytochemist as much as anything, a geneticist as much as anything, and so I was a bit kind of at loose. I wasn't sure what to do, and then suddenly this zombie project dropped on my lap. And in a nutshell, what had happened is that a zombie, by folk definition, is a living dead. It's an individual who's been brought to his end by magic, condemned into a state of purgatory that involves slavery and condemned to kind of live in a liminal space between the living and the dead. And the zombie phenomena had been, of course, written about, exploited in dramatic ways in pulp fiction, in films, but there was a consistent stream of evidence in the popular literature and academic reports in missionary journals of the reputed existence of a folk poison said to be so powerful that it could bring on a state of apparent death that could fool the physician. And when the case of a man called Clavius Narcisse came to light in 1980, a man who had been pronounced dead in 1962 at the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in the Artibonite Valley, an American-directed institution which keeps impeccable medical records. The physicians who had witnessed his death were both American trained. One was in fact an American. The death certificate, fingerprints of family members that were authenticated by forensic experts at Scotland Yard. All these lines of evidence suggested that this individual had actually been misdiagnosed dead, and he had somehow returned into the realm of the living. And the case came to the attention of a man called Lamarck Douillon, who was then the head of the Psychiatric Institute in Port-au-Prince, which was named for a man, Nathan Klein, who was the father of psychopharmacology. It was Nathan Klein who broke the back of Freud in the 1950s by saying some psychiatric conditions could have a chemical basis that could be treated pharmacologically. He was, in a sense, the father of Thorazine, even the father of Prozac, if you will. And his close colleague at McGill, a man called Heinz Lehmann, had trained Douillon. And Douillon had been investigating all these popular accounts of zombies, and he had been rewarded with this very provocative case of Clavius Narcisse. And clearly, this man who had returned to his village in 1980, none of his family members doubted his identity. and they immediately told him to get lost, which was interesting. And obviously, neither of these great scientists, including Klein, who had won 2 Lasker Awards, the American equivalent of the Nobel Prize, believed in magic. But it was not inconceivable that a folk preparation could exist that could bring on a state of apparent death so profound that it could fool a Western physician, and then the individual, through whatever pharmacological or social or psychological or punitive means, could be sort of kept in a state of perpetual limbo, if you will. Nobody really knew what that was all about at that time. And so they hired me to go down to Haiti to find this drug, not because they were interested in zombies as much as that if such a drug existed, it conceivably had applications for modern medicine, particularly um, um, uh, for anesthesiology. And even Klein was interested. He had been contracted by NASA to try to figure out what drugs might be used to create a kind of suspended animation for long distance space flight. Sounds kind of out of the realm of Star Wars, but this was a real initiative. And what was interesting about that research, without going into it in any kind of detail, is that whereas I was sent down to Haiti ostensibly to find, quote unquote, the drug used to make zombies, well, I knew that no drug makes a social phenomena. Every drug creates an ambivalent potential for good or evil, upon which cultural expectations and context go to work. But if I was sent down ostensibly to find a drug that could be used to make zombies, over the course of 2 years, I found myself studying rather the psychological, spiritual, political, social dimensions of a chemical possibility. And so what excited me about that is it took the basic mechanism of ethnobotany, if you will. It turns out that the main ingredient, according to my hypothesis, was a fish, but it doesn't really matter. It took the ethnobiological lens, if you will, that allowed us to see the phenomenon in a different way. And through that lens were revealed these ethnographic, historical, political vistas that had been not available to anthropology. So at the end of the day, my investigation, having identified the poison and having known that without doubt the sorcerers had identified in their environment a natural product that not only could make people appear to be dead and fool a physician, but it had done so in innumerable occasions around the world in cultural contexts that had nothing to do with Haiti. Suddenly, this phenomena went from the realm of the phantasmagoric into the plausible. And as I opened up those windows, if you will, I found myself studying the secret societies of Haiti, which turned out to be the most powerful arbiter of social and political life in the country, and the key to understanding the power of the Duvalier dictatorship. So literally, ethnobiology took me in through a window that led me ultimately to the streets of Gonaïves as a revolution erupted all around me that overthrew Baby Doc.
Another fascinating story. And I love how, often researchers could stop, right? And to continue to follow the thread where it's leading you.
Well, and part of it, there's been some criticism of that work, part of the negative priest or the sorcerer in making the poison, one ingredient is human remains. And that involves digging up a corpse in the graveyard. And I was there while they did that. And you can call that an ethical lapse if you want. But truth is that cultures all around the world use human relics as signs of the transient nature of life. We use relics in the Catholic faith. We use them in Tibetan Buddhism. If you go to the Church of the Capuchin Order in Rome, the crypts are full of the flayed bones of 30,000 priests. And there's a little message: that which you are, we once were; that which we are, ye shall become. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. But my bigger goal was to take a phenomena, the Haitian zombie, that had been used in an explicitly racist way to denigrate an entire people, and to try to make sense out of it. and in doing so show that it was a form of sanction imposed by these secret societies. Now, you have to understand that these secret societies, the Bizongo Champuel, were dreaded. I was funded by a foundation set up by Nathan Klein with a benefactor who was David Merrick, the Broadway and Hollywood producer. But within 24 hours, Merrick had a stroke. And Klein unfortunately died during routine heart surgery. And so I went from having no money, flush with money, to no money. And so I applied to the National Science Foundation, and I eventually was granted a PhD dissertation improvement grant, but to study specifically the secret societies to see to what extent they were symbolic or executive function, and a purely ethnographic research, right? And the reviewers who gave me that money nevertheless wrote on the application, the response, "Davis must be told that if he tries to do this research, he will be killed." That was the reputation of these societies. So one of the places where I'm a little embittered is that those who have tried to attack my reputation as having crossed some Rubicon by simply being present when a group of voodooists do what they do, when they walk on the dark side, if you will, was negligible compared to what I was putting myself at risk to try to do, which was to make sense of a sensation and to show that the exploitation of this phenomenon by Hollywood had been rooted in racism. And I was trying all the time to reveal the obvious to the world, that if we ask ourselves to name the great religions of the world, why is it that Africa is always left out? It's incredible if you think about it. The tacit assumption being that African people south of the Sahara never had any religious beliefs. Well, of course they did. And voodoo is not a black magic cult. It's the distillation of those profound religious ideas. Voodoo is just a fond word from Dahomey that means a spirit or God. And so you ask yourself, why did this religion become reduced to caricature? Well, for very obvious reasons. Haiti was the only successful slave revolt in history. For 100 years, Haiti was the only independent Black nation. They funded Simon Bolivar on the condition that he free the slaves in Gran Colombia. They bought shipments of slaves destined for the American South and granted them freedom in Haiti. And in the 1920s, the US Marines occupied Haiti as part of that whole kind of Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny and all that. And everybody above the rank of sergeant got a book contract. And the Marines at that time were largely from the American South during the height of Jim Crow. And the books had names like Cannibal Cousins, Black Baghdad, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, A Puritan in Voodoo Land, The White King of La Gonave, The Magic Island. And all of this pulp fiction was filled with voodoo pins and needles and dolls that don't exist, zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people, which is not the case in any way, and children bred for the cauldron. And those books essentially said, and they gave rise to the RKO movies of the 40s, Night of the Living Dead, Zombies on Broadway, Zombies of the Stratosphere. They essentially said to the American people during the era of Jim Crow that any country where such abominations go on, can only find its redemption through military occupation. And that's why when I went to Haiti in 1982, if you can believe it, there were more Western missionary organizations operating in that country than individual Western trained physicians. And so that's what I was taking on with the zombie work. And to have it in some sense tarnished by false allegations of ethical breaches could only have sort of been promoted by those who have no idea what my work involved in Haiti.
Well, again, there are so many threads to follow. And listening to you, it's the same as listening to other talks you've given, or is following the thread and not seeing things, not just collecting the hay and piling it in a haystack, but seeing how it connects to the field and the farmer. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how seeing that mix, the interconnection of everything then has subsequently informed the work you've done.
Well, I think
and your perspective on culture and biological diversity.
Well, I think we use the word interdisciplinary a little, kind of slack, like what does it really mean? But there is this tendency in science in the modern era to become so narrowly focused, right? So the curse of the scientist is to know more and more about less and less. And because I never really had academic aspirations, I always thought of myself, even when I wasn't thinking about it, I've always been by nature a storyteller, and I say that not in a flippant or a trivial way. Polemics are never persuasive. Politicians follow, they never lead, but storytellers change the world, and they always have. And I also had the most strongest sense very early on that the issues that I was being exposed to by my two mentors at Harvard in particular, David Maybury Lewis, who was creating cultural survival as I was his undergraduate student, and Professor Schultes, and Professor Schultes has sometimes been being colored as a conservationist. He was a man of the 19th century for whom overt notions of conservation almost didn't make a lot of sense to him. But that said, his great contribution from the start was to recognize the legitimacy of indigenous knowledge, to honor that knowledge. The most amazing thing about Schultes' career in the Amazon is that in many places that he went between 1941 and 1953, he was the first white person that the indigenous people ever met who didn't either want to exploit their labor, rape their daughters, or transform their souls. He was a solitary student of plants who sat metaphorically at the feet of the shaman. And that reverence and respect permeated all the work that he did. So every single paper he ever wrote practically began, the Amazon and the knowledge of the indigenous people who know it best is at risk. And we were kind of, infused with that. Anyone who came into his orbit, I mean, Tim, Mickey Balick, Mark Plotkin, myself, and I was very fortunate because I was exposed to this issue of biological diversity even before Tom Lovejoy coined the term with Ed Wilson, but also cultural diversity. And we forget now, Anne, how those two things, which we've now obviously brought them together, we all recognize that the same threats that cause the elimination of biological diversity are eroding the wonder of cultural diversity, but we forget how wide those worlds were apart. And let me tell you one anecdote to illustrate that. In 1979, I think it was, I was a graduate student at Harvard, and His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, ended his first ever trip to the West with a lecture at Sanders Theater on the nature of reality. And the same night, Ed Wilson, the marvelous naturalist, was across the way in the Lowell Lecture Hall, introducing a man called Norman Myers, who had written a book called The Sinking Ark, which was one of the very first books to draw attention to the looming biodiversity crisis. Now, naturally, all the faculty and all the students were across the way at Sanders Theater to hear the Dalai Lama. And in apologizing to Mr. or Dr. Myers for the sparse audience in Lowell Lecture Hall, Ed Wilson, who would regret these words to this day, as kind and decent a man who's ever walked the earth, the greatest naturalist of the 20th century and today, nevertheless said, and I quote, "If even Harvard students can't get their priorities right and they'd rather be across the way listening to that religious kook, we know how far we've got to educate the public at large." Well, of course, the Dalai Lama's very presence there was speaking out for the cultural integrity of an entire civilization that was being ground to dust by the communist Chinese. And I promise you, I must have been the only student, and that night running back and forth between the two lectures because I had this intuition. It wasn't particularly profound. I just was lucky to be in the orbit of two such extraordinary mentors. And I felt from the very beginning that the lessons and what we were learning about the plight of culture and the fate of the forest were issues that had to be brought into the public sphere. I couldn't understand the idea of academic silos where scholars just spoke to themselves. So that I had that sense of wanting to be a storyteller. Now here's the supreme irony, which brings us up to today. is that, you know, the great intuition of American anthropology was cultural relativism, the idea that the world into which you were born is just one model of reality, and the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you or failed attempts at being modern. Every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And the anthropologists would say that when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 different voices of humanity. But that intuition of Franz Boas, inspired as he was by his experience with the Inuit in Baffin Island and later the Kwakwaka'wakw in the salmon forests of the Pacific Northwest, was just that. It was kind of an intuition, but it was confirmed in a sense within this generation by the moonshot of this generation, which is not a journey into space that revealed to us the blue planet floating in that velvet void of space, that incredible image brought back to us from Apollo, but a journey into the fiber of our being, whereby geneticists in the last decades have shown without doubt that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race truly is a fiction. We're all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all descendants of the same individuals who were birthed in Africa, some of whom walked out of Africa 65,000 years ago and embarked on this extraordinary journey over 40,000 years, 2,500 human generations that carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But here's the important point. If you accept that scientific truth brought to us not by social anthropologists, but by hard scientists, by geneticists, if you will, by the Wilson side of that dichotomy, if you will, it means that we all share the same genetic endowment. We all therefore share the same genius. And whether that genius is invested into technological wizardry, which has been the great achievement of the West, or by contrast, placed into the complex challenge of unraveling the mystic threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy of culture. That old Victorian idea, informed by Darwin, that cultures like species evolve, that somehow we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized of the Strand of London, with European society sitting at the apex of a pyramid that slopes down to the so-called primitives of the world, that all these societies are somehow frozen stage sets on an imagined evolutionary trajectory rising to ourselves. That has been absolutely debunked by modern science and shown to be an artifact of the 19th century, no more relevant to our lives today than the notion of clergymen in that era that the earth was but 6,000 years old. In the stunning affirmation of the intuitions of Franz Boas, genetics has come to the fore to prove the legitimacy and the truth of his notion of cultural relativism. And what this really means is that every culture really does have something to say, and each deserves to be heard, and none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. So if you take that perspective, and then you deal with the haunting, indisputable data from the linguists, who without any countervailing opinion, unanimously will say that of the 7,000 languages spoken the day Anne you were born, today fully half aren't being taught to children. Every 2 weeks, some elder passes away and carries with him or her into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. This means that we are living through a time when fully half of humanity's intellectual, social, spiritual, ecological knowledge is at risk. No biologist, including Ed Wilson, would suggest that 50% of all plants and animals are morbid, because that would be simply not accurate as far as we know. But the most optimistic scenario, the most pessimistic scenario, rather, in the realm of biological diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the indication of that, of course, is language loss. And I say that to audiences all the time. How would you feel to be enveloped in silence, to be the last speaker of your language, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry, or to anticipate the promise of your descendants? Those who say, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? I always say, what a great idea. But let's make that universal language a Nuktatak. Let's make it Tibetan. Let's make it Haida. And then you begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, I love my language. I'm a writer, for God's sake, but I don't want my language any more than my culture to be some kind of nerve gas that sweeps over the world.
Again, so many threads, and I'm watching the time, and we have about 11 minutes left, and so I want to ask, so what do we do with that knowledge, that awareness? How do we sit with it? And as I think of asking that, I'm thinking of several things I've heard you say in different talks. One, you talked about the importance of bearing witness to the world and not trying to change the world.
Well, no, I think that's a bit of a misreading. That's a quote from one of my favorite writers, Peter Matthewson, who said, anyone who thinks they can change the world is both wrong and dangerous. And of course, he had in mind people like Hitler and Mao and Stalin. That's what he really meant. And I would say, but writers have an obligation to bear witness to the world at the very least. I think what I really meant by that is that one of the ways, and that I've personally at least been able to sort of stay in the game, if you will. People are always saying to me, if the situation seems to be dire, how do you maintain your optimism? And my answer to that is say, first of all, pessimism is an indulgence, despair, an insult to the imagination, just like orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. But more importantly, and this touches on your very important question there. I don't expect to win. Bitterness comes to those who are disappointed. One of the wonderful lessons I've received from the Buddhist path is that life is indeed a path. It's not a destination. The goal is a state of mind, not a place. And if you have no expectations of success, and you realize it comes down to something very simple my father told me when I was a little boy. And my father was not a religious man at all. In fact, any religious intuitions he might have had were shattered during the Second World War, just like his father, my grandfather's spiritual life was crushed in the trenches of the First World War. But Dad did believe in good and evil. And he didn't believe for a moment this Christian notion that evil would sometime disappear. He had lived through the bloody century and seen too much to believe that. We have in Christianity, for example, this notion of the fallen archangel as the devil and the Christ child, and that we always put them in moral combat so that the Christ child will vanquish the devil. And we have this idea that at one time that conflict will end in absolute triumph and the world will be cleansed, there'll be rapture, we'll all go up to heaven or whatever it is. The Buddhists wouldn't say that. When in the medieval era, if a clergyman, for example, or a monk would say the obvious, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil to exist in the world? That was a famous heresy for which an individual could be burned at the stake, because it threatened to fundamentally the foundation of the church. But by contrast, when Lord Krishna in the Hindu Vedic tradition was asked exactly that same question, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil to exist in the universe? Lord Krishna reputedly said, to thicken the plot. In other words, in the Eastern way of thinking, there's duality, there's not good and evil. And that as long as you don't ever expect evil to go away, you don't get disappointed when it raises its head. And that doesn't mean that you act that you embrace some kind of nihilism. On the contrary, it only fires your heart to do more good. And my dad used to say, it's very simple. There's only one thing in life, son. There's good and evil. Take your side and get on with it. And that's a lesson that I've always learned. And that's why, all my life I've tried to fight for social justice. And we back to our first words in this conversation, Anna, how difficult it is to write a book. I've always needed to be motivated by some mission when I write a book, whether it's to tell the truth about voodoo, to expose what our grandfathers went to in the Western Front, to show with the book Magdalena, River of Dreams, that it's unjust the way that Colombia has suffered simply because of our grotesque consumption of cocaine hydrochloride. There's got to be a kind of a mission to keep the energy going over the course of the many years that it can take to write a book. And so my sense is that, you know, as you push the wheel of righteousness, if you will, and that may sound a little pompous, but the side of good, the side of light, we all know that what that means. As you're pushing that side uphill or even across the flats, the other side is also pushing against you, and you have no choice but to just keep pushing, and you're never going to win. You're not going to win every environmental battle. I've won some and I've lost some. I've seen mountains I love torn apart by open pit mines, and I've seen valleys that embrace my spirit, protected for all time. But the point is, that's what I meant by you can't change the world. And one of the lessons I learned in my first years of being radicalized at Harvard and joining the SDS and all these radical groups, I within a year, I saw that the political movements were basically all about ego and hatred, and ideology and totalitarian thinking. And that's why to this day, I am as suspect of the far right as I am of the woke orthodoxies of the indulgent left. The middle way is what the Buddha advocated. It's what the Dalai Lama has walked. And it seemed to me the way that my father inspired me to live.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about what you said about 7,000 different cultures and different ways to live, and yet also in many of the cultures that ethnobotanists or anthropologists who are working with plants, there tends to be traditions of reciprocity that are not so extractive. And
I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, you know, here, you know, one of the most important things is, you know, because of the triumph of secular materialism has become the conceit of modernity, but just its ubiquity and its power shouldn't imply that it's the norm. It's completely anomalous. And, you know, one of the lessons of anthropology is that every culture is a product of its own history. And in our tradition, as we attempted to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith during the Enlightenment in particular, we deanimated the world. When we threw out, you know, all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, also metaphor. When Descartes said that all that exists is mind and material, in a gesture, he deanimated the planet. And in time, as Saul Bellow wrote, science made a house cleaning of belief. And so the idea that the flight of a bird could have meaning was ridiculed. But missing from that is that in all cultures around the world, the vast majority, the dynamic has been not to deanimate the world, but to see the world as being alive. The world is not just a stage set upon which only the human drama unfolds. Reciprocity has driven the human experience in almost all cultures. Reciprocity often expressed through metaphor. And so what do I mean by that? You and I, Anne, were raised in a culture whereby a mountain was a pile of rock, where a forest was cellulose and board feet. Well, that made us very different, and our attitude toward that mountain and that forest very different than, say, my godchildren in the mountains of Peru, raised to believe that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct their destiny. Or my friends here in the coasts of British Columbia, raised to believe that a forest is the abode of spiritual beings that will be embraced during the Hamatsa initiation. The point is not who's right and who's wrong. It's how the belief system mediates a human interaction with profoundly different consequences for the ecological footprint of a people. I mean, this is so important because, you know, our way of life, successful as it's been, is so shallow in terms of its history. For 300 years, we've been consuming the ancient sunlight of the world. And the consequences of that are all around us. And some years ago, you know, I wrote a book called The Wayfinders, and an editor put on a snappy title, subtitle, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World. And I didn't really like the subtitle because it implied that these individual cultures were vestigial, which they're not. You know, they're dynamic living peoples being driven out of existence, not drifting out of existence. And they're driven out of existence by identifiable forces, suggesting that human beings, if we're the agents of cultural destruction, can be the facilitators of cultural survival. But nevertheless, I had to answer that question in the book, which I did implicitly, but at the end explicitly, with two words: climate change. And not to suggest for a moment that we go back to a pre-industrial past or that any culture of the world be kept from the benefits and the wonder of the best of modernity, if you will, but rather to suggest critically that the very existence, as anthropology teaches us, of these other ways of thinking, other ways of being, other ways of interacting with social, economic, social, ecological, even spiritual space around us, puts the lie to those of us in our own culture who say that we cannot change, as we all know we must change the fundamental way in which we inhabit this planet.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're at the end of the time, but I do want to ask this one question that I feel like is an example of what can happen when that materialistic, or however you want to put it, way of being in clashes around. And when we spoke before, you talked about how the shamans that you've encountered in Colombia and Peru, they're using ayahuasca for a collective journey for the culture, the community. And often Westerners will go down and it's for the healing of their individual soul. And to me,
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
interesting.
I'm not judging, and I'm not judging or being critical, Anna, of anybody going off to the Amazon in search of a personal quest. I certainly did it myself as a young man. I just think that there, in the contemporary commercialization of ayahuasca around places like Iquitos, and there is this sort of focus on self. You know, I'm going to heal myself, and there's a tradition of that throughout South America of kind of folk healers who will welcome people with all sorts of problems, medical, economic, marital, whatever, and actually go through individual healing ceremonies with them. So it's not like it's out of left field, but only to point out that in the areas where ayahuasca was sort of invented, if you will, my experience has been that it's often a collective journey, with the goal being the well-being of the entire community. The Badasana, for example, where the individuals in the state of intoxication, donning the feathers that aren't ritual regalia, they really are the rays of the sun. They're not talking metaphor there, and their most profound cultural instinct amongst the Badasana is the intuition that plants and animals are only people in another dimension of reality. So it's just of interest to pay attention to how these plants are used. I mean, and this goes back to one other thing about this whole question of, exploiting the forest for new medicinal plants. I, like Schultes, began every one of my papers as a young scholar with a warning about the Amazon being threatened. And because we all felt that we had to find some economic rationale for conservation, we kept talking about the forest as nature's pharmacy. Well, this gets a little complicated for a couple of reasons worth going into very briefly. Of the 2,000 medicinal plants that Schultes identified, not one became a pharmaceutical product. When we say that the forest is full of all these new drugs to be discovered, we always cite the handful of classic plants, coca and cocaine, cinchona bark and quinine, D-tubo-curare and curare, the arrow poisons, and even what Steve's going to come on and speak to you about next week, the extraction of a substance very effectively from croton. Well, again, this was a plant that was well known throughout the Northwest Amazon. It's not an exception to the rule, it is the rule. And I think this idea that's been promoted by environmental groups that that there's some shaman in some distant corner of the forest who's got in his repertoire the treatment that will cure cancer is a kind of misreading of the nature of what shamanism is. I mean, for example, amongst the Badasana and Makuna, the Tanimucos, the shaman don't even deal with medicinal plants. That's something for the women to do to treat the ailments of their children somatically. The shaman of the Badasana, for example, is less a priest or a physician than a nuclear engineer who periodically goes into the heart of the reactor to reprogram the world. That's what the shaman does. And what I found is that the rhetoric of nature's pharmacy actually got so overheated that it caused great harm. Because when you had companies becoming capitalized through venture capital to the tune of a couple $100 million, and companies that had to maintain a certain kind of hype about their potential, this caused some challenges in Latin America. I mean, $250 million may seem like, is a trivial sum to actually bring a drug from natural product through clinical trials. I mean, a drug like the antibiotic ciprofloxacin, I think, cost Bayer or something on the order of $2 billion to create, right? And yet $250 million, just to cite an arbitrary figure, seems like an awful lot to a Latin American bureaucrat. And this perpetuated this idea of intellectual property theft and biopiracy. And before you knew it, you had a whole kind of group of well-intentioned middlemen and women who were the protectors of the intellectual property of indigenous people. And it was all, to some extent, a house of cards, because the pharmaceutical industry was in fact not exploiting, I mean, with exceptions, of course, Monsanto obscenely trying to, patent ayahuasca. And so, I mean, it's not that we haven't, the problem, we have to be vigilant, but in general, it created a situation where technocrats in Latin America, for example, became paranoid, and it became almost impossible to do the kind of basic botanical work that is at the foundation of expanding your understanding of the flora of the Amazon. The idea that a young kid from Harvard with his own money or her own money could just go down to South America, get a plant collecting permit, promise and dutifully fulfill that promise by leaving specimens in country at various institutions, but taking specimens out of the country to disseminate to herbaria around the world, both for identification and to enhance our global understanding of the region. That kind of fundamental research became almost impossible because of this exaggerated hype of the pharmaceutical potential of the Amazon. And I'm not suggesting anyone had anything but the best intentions, but one thing I've learned in life is we should always be concerned about even the best of intentions.
There's so much more I'd love to, and following on that thread, but we don't have time now, but again, that it follows out because of the history of economic, political relations between the research, the scholars, and, that it becomes this house of cards and complicated. And brings me back to when you got off the plane and you put one step and then the next step, and also bearing witness, really paying attention and following the threads. Do you have any final comments you want to make?
I think I just, I'm such an advocate of scholars being participants in the public square. I mean, anthropology was born in activism. And I'll leave you with one thought of a piece that I've just written. When we look at, consider the way your great-grandfather thought, Anne, about race, about the role of women, about the role of men, about the natural world, whatever, right? And not one of those Victorian certitudes would you agree with, and many of them you'd find morally reprehensible, right? And then we look from where we are today, a generation in which women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color, as I always say, from the woodshed to the White House, and gay people from the closet to the altar. We forget that before any of those political movements, so social movements could come to fruition, something had to happen to crack the facade of those certitudes. Some fundamental intellectual challenge had to come along and say, that is all bullshit. And you know what it was? It was a band of contrarians, the anthropologists, who gathered around Franz Boas at the risk of their careers. They were hounded by the FBI. They were denied promotions. They were ridiculed in the press, only for standing up for what was in fact the truth. And because of that, they gave us the modern era. And Franz Boas deserves to rank, surely, along with Freud and Einstein and Darwin, as the four great intellectual pillars of our era. So if, for example, Anne, you think it's quite normal that two women could have a family, and that two men could have a family, and that family would be a good family as long as there's love in the house. And if you think it's normal that a Jewish friend of yours would find solace in the Buddhist Dharma, and if you find it quite normal that an Asian friend of yours might fall in love with an Irish boy, then you are a child of anthropology. All of that was brought into being by a different vision of life itself, an embracing holistic understanding, which began as intuition and was confirmed by genetics, that all of humanity is one great interconnected whole.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a good note to end things on. Thank you so much for taking the time and for speaking so broadly and deeply about your experiences. And thank everyone who's joined us once again. And we'll share a link to the full recording probably in the next 24 hours or so. And thank you again.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah. And I can send you a copy of the chat as well if you'd like after.